my sin not impart, but the whole.
So welcome to our studies here, back to the basics. And the focus is the biblical study of sin hamartiology. And we have been doing pretty well. We have undertaken this study as to where we're going to get our source of information, our sources of information. We have also looked at the Old Testament words for sin. We have looked at the New Testament words for sin. And then one of the reservoirs of the Old Testament words for sin is Psalm 51, which we did under the King David special. And then we come to Psalm 32. This should be our final session in Psalm 32. That is how sin impacts the human constitution, body, soul, and spirit. And we have been looking at Psalm 32 in that light. So I want to finish that up. Then next week, we should be looking at how in the world did sin show up in a creature that God has made perfect and placed him in a perfect environment. We're going to be looking at that. Let us remind ourselves of our nature. Man is a tripartite being, three aspects to our existence. There is the spiritual aspect. When God made Adam, he breathed into Adam's nostril the breath of life. And by virtue of that, man became a spiritual being, a living being. So that is because of that which God breathed into Adam's nostril that mankind, Adam and Eve, could have had fellowship with God, communicate with spiritual being. So we have the spirit that makes us spirit conscious. We have the soul, the suke, that makes us self-conscious, who we are. And also the body that makes us world conscious or material conscious. You need that body to sit, you need that body to walk and to talk and to do things with the physical world around us. So here we have then Paul's prayer in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, that at the coming of the Lord we'll be found whole, without blemish, spirit, soul, and body. Paul prayed. And we have been looking up close and personal at these facets of the human person. The spirit, we refer to that as pneumological. That's the word for spirit, pneuma. Anything that is related to the spiritual world or function of the human constitution is referred to as pneumological, related to the spirit. Anything that has to do with functionality, that has to do with the function of the soul, from the Greek word suke, we call that psychological. You're familiar with that more than you're familiar with pneumological, because we have that area of discipline and specialty in our institutions of learning. Then with the body, anything that relates to the body or has to do with the function of the body is referred to as physiological, because that's where you get your word physician. He's the specialist who specializes in treating issues relating to your body. From that, we have the development of specialists in different areas. And that gives us a better understanding and treatment of the function of the body. So David said in Psalm 32 and verse 4, then we looked at this last week, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer. And those are very vivid graphic description of a person's health that has gone south because of the disintegration and the impact of sin. We call that category pneuma, that which is related to the spirit and the function of the spiritual world, spirit-based, a problem that has its origin in the spiritual facets of man. But the symptoms come in the area of our psychological being, in our thinking, the exercise of our will. And one of the dreams that I have in life was to become a psychologist. And that is not realized, has not been realized, but I've done quite a number of much study in the field of psychology in the biblical or the spiritual world. And so having been a Christian counselor, a trained Christian counselor, of course, we have to study psychology. So there are things, when things go wrong in the spiritual facet of our being, when we are not right spiritually, our bodies produce and manifest psychological disorders in the function of the soul, the psychological, if you prefer, psychological, from suke. So the soul with David now is affected because of spiritual misconduct. His act of adultery was, of course, not only physical, but also spiritual, because God has designed us as sexual and spiritual beings. In fact, sin has done untold damage to our spiritual being, that we have lost contact with the link between sexuality and spirituality. And you see that in areas of man's sexual misconduct and aberrations. For example, bestiality. Man engaging in sexual intimacy with creatures that are not spiritual beings. And that plunges human sexuality into animalism. And so you have certain manifestations of disorder of this nature, like rape, though it is with another spiritual being, but because it's against the person's volition. See how we are making sense now of the psychological aspect of our being. God designed human sexuality to be experienced between two adults that agree, that consent. Our sexuality is not going to function in a healthy and proper way without the exercise of volition, because it has to do with the soul. So I hope you're following me now. So we are right on target. We are on focus when we're talking about sexuality as it relates to our spiritual being, because sex is more than just the physical body. It is something God designed for human being who happen to be both spiritual being and the physical being. And that is why we have done untold damage, that is the church, by handing over to the world to educate us and teach us about human sexuality. Of all the subjects, we don't want blind people to instruct us about our sexuality. We need to come from that, and when it comes to that subject, we need to first and foremost address it from the maker's manual. But then again, we can become so spiritual, pseudo-spiritual, that we develop a negative approach and attitude towards our sexuality. There are some Christians who are very, very, very uncomfortable. I never forget my first series on the family that I conducted many, many years ago. And when I came to the issue of human sexuality under the title, Our Sacred Sexuality, there were people who resolved in their mind that they're either going to tune me out or they're going to leave or better yet, not return until that subject is exhausted. Christians, born again Christians, who believe that sex is something designed by Satan, that sex is something evil, that sex is anti-God and anti-spiritual. And nothing could be further from the truth. We have seen when we make such mistake in the church of not informing of our believers of what God has to say about our sexuality, our sacred sexuality. That's when the enemy shows up with the floodgates of error and aberrations and disinformation. And that is what we have in our churches. The preacher has been silenced, or he thinks that he should not address it. Yes, there are still Christians around us today that when you construct a sentence with God and sex in it, they just think something not right about the sentence. That's exactly when we remove spirituality from sexuality. So we have all these misinformed view, and we turn to the world to teach us about this. Hollywood, with all its theatrics and with all its aberrant behavior, are not the best ones to teach us about sexuality. And I believe that the church is the most qualified institution to teach about the subject of our spirituality and our sexuality. And so God has given me the task of ministering his word from Genesis to Revelation. And the issue of our sacred sexuality, we addressed that in the series on the family. We addressed that when we are dealing with anthropology, that God made us as sexual beings. We also addressed the issue that Satan himself has developed interest in human sexuality, because when God designed him, angels are not sexual beings. But having fallen from God's order, falling angels have become beings of disorderly conduct. And so they have developed interest in human sexuality. And we have had some very, very serious infiltration of angelic misbehavior and evil, tampering with and impacting human sexuality. We will address that in another subject. So the soul is now affected by spiritual misconduct. First, he said his vitality, his motivation, the desire to get out of bed, the desire to face the task of the day. He has been robbed of his vitality and motivation. And the description is drought of summer. The picture is of a body that is suffering from dehydration, not having enough fluid in your body, not enough water. And so you have the description, drought of summer. Gonna feel tired in the morning, and by afternoon, when you would normally retire from the physical work, you're already exhausted, perhaps asleep, overwhelmed physically. And that is a psychological state to be in. So sin does affect the soul. It affects how we think. It affects our mind. Whatever type of sin it is. And sexual sins are no exemption to that. So it affects the soul. We could trace David's thinking. Remember? Once Bathsheba told the palace guard to let David know that 1 month has passed and she has missed her menstrual cycle. David got the message that she's pregnant. Because since the departure of her husband Uriah to battle, she had her menstrual cycle. Since intercourse, the last she had was with David, an act of adultery. And when David heard that now, just notice how sin started to impact the thinking of a man who's known for wisdom, is known as a man of God, a godly person who gives godly counsel. Notice what this fellow is going to do. He first sent for Uriah, as we saw. He's not thinking straight. But the idea is to bring about a state of deception, is to have the soldier coming from the army, coming from warfare in a pre-retirement. The king sent for him, brought him home, and said, okay, while you're here, go home to your wife and perform your intimate duties. Of which Uriah said, no, be it far from me that while the king's men are on the battlefield, that I should go home and be intimate with my wife. I've already paid tribute to the character and to the integrity of a soldier like Uriah, who was from the Hittite Empire. And he refused. David locked the door to his palace. The next day, the palace guards informed him that Uriah didn't leave the steps. He slept on the steps. He refused to go home. That's when David, still not thinking, turn on the heat now and remove the plot from one of deception into drunkenness. He decided to invite David to have invite Uriah to have a drink. And he couldn't refuse to dine with the king. And so he gave him wine to drink, whatever type of alcoholic beverage they have then. They had many. And he entered the state of drunkenness. And David tried that, still didn't work. David still not thinking. That's when David decided to resort to murder, death. I told you about the three D's: deception, drunkenness, and death. A man who is ordinarily is a straight thinking person. You see the impact of sin? Volition. David was no longer able to make proper choices. His will was influenced by that sin. What about his emotions? Well, we have the description there over in Samuel. He refused to eat. He protested. He entered into an acute state of depression. So he was in an emotional state of misery. Self-consciousness. David thought the problem was Uriah. He's yet to own up that Uriah is not the problem. The problem happened to be David. How many times have we, when sin comes in, it's everybody else's fault? We learned that from Adam. Adam, have you eaten from the tree from which I told you not to eat? You would think Adam would answer yes or no. Oh no. Sin again impact his thinking, his mind. Instead of saying yes, I'm sorry, nothing. What did he do? The woman you gave me. Now, it just shows you again, he's not aware of, ready to take responsibility for his decision. He's blaming somebody else. Sin will impact you that way. You blame everybody else for what's going on, except to take responsibility. And so he blamed the woman. Conscience began to bother him so much that sleep will not come. He became restless. It's going to damage all of his relationship with the people around him. We saw the same thing with Saul, suffering from manic depression when David was a shepherd boy and he was the harpist playing music for him to soothe his depression, the King Saul's depression. And when he heard about what they were singing, somebody wrote a song, Saul has slain his thousands, David is 10,000. No man going under manic depression wants to hear that. Now he felt threatened. The wicked flee when no one pursue. He felt threatened that David is next thing you know, they're going to say King David and no longer say King Saul. And he tried to kill David with the javelin and by setting him up many times. So it's just the fact that none of us sin, all different types of sin, impact how we think. We just need to look back on our lives when we told a lie and how we have to tell a bigger one to cover the first. And the whole thing, the avalanche continues until we are face to face with a collapse. That's the nature of sin. So notice David said, when I kept silent, my bones grew old. We look at that, the energy. The human physiology gets its strength from the skeletal system we saw. That was the understanding in the ancient world that is still true today. A broken bone, you can't use that part of your body, even though the muscles are still intact. And so now we move into another category, Pneuma, physiological. The one before that is affect the soul, your thinking, your decision-making process, your awareness of sin, your willingness to say, I have sinned. That's the impact of a spiritual failure on the psychological function of the human body. Now we come to the physiological, manic depression, like I referred to. Despondency, discouragement, a feeling of inadequacy. Now, how do we have those things being treated today? Well, your physician is probably going to send you to a psychologist, and thank God that area has been accepted today as bona fide area of treating the human person, not just the body, physical, physiological, but the fact that there's another side to him, and that is the psychological. But what we still have not recognized today is the area of the spiritual. Only in Christian counseling, there's an admission and recognition that when things are not right in a person's spiritual existence, like sin, there will be impact in the other two aspects of our being. Like I said to you a couple of weeks ago, it took psychology many, many years to be recognized and accepted as a bona fide science. And I believe one day, if the Lord doesn't come, the area of the spiritual realities, people will come to recognize that spirituality and pneumological existence are real. But it's going to take a long time, because it's not like religions agree about spiritual matters. We only know they address spiritual matters, but they're never in agreement regarding that. So that's another tall order. But we as Christians know that. We as leaders and counselors know human beings are tripartite beings, spirit, soul, and body. The secular world just deal with soul and body. We take it to a different level, of course. So we have some psychological disorder when things are not right in your soul. These are some of the problems. You have mental illness, addiction, callousness. There's an issue with self-image. Either you have an inflated ego or a deflated ego. You feel more important than you are, or you feel less important than you are. Romans 12 challenges us that we are to think soberly. We are to think in a rational way based on how God has equipped us. We should not think above, nor should we think below. My favorite is we are bearers of God's image. Sin has damaged and dented us, yes, but we still bear that image and likeness. I said, preacher, how do you know that? Because God dispatched his son from the realms of glory to come to rescue us. And the rescue mission never included horses nor dogs, only human beings that Christ came to die for, and he died for our sins according to the scriptures. So we know that much. Then there is hate. Whether it is motivated by racial identity, disparity, or the fact that is inequality, whatever the problem is on the platform of race, that it can produce hate. We talk about hate crimes. Then we have anxiety, of which I don't think any of us has ever escaped that. There are different types and different levels of anxiety. And Paul even addressed the believers that they ought to be anxious for nothing. Anxiety is when your body and mind enters into a state of dysfunction because you're focusing on something. Okay? You're focusing, in fact, we call it become obsessed with. You're given something more attention than it truly deserves. And as a result of that, it affects your energy level, your perception. Like I said, there are different levels of anxiety. When anxiety is not properly treated, it becomes depression. And that's why it's always good when you feel anxious to get counsel. Better yet, when we understand how humans function as leaders, when we know people are going through certain types of stress, we make provision for the anxiety that they are going through. We are aware whether it is bereavement, whether it is a stressful situation of having a loved one being incarcerated, whatever it is. We know that you're not going to be yourself or things are not normal. We ought to know that as leaders. And so we are to respond to your immediate situation in that way. Anxiety goes untreated, becomes depression. And then there are different types and levels of depression too as well. A depression that can produce suicidal thought. All that we need to be aware of. I know there are some Christians who have the erroneous idea that a Christian can't commit suicide. We have had discussion before about this, and some believers are very strong on that. How can a believer take his or her own life? And I normally just have one question for you. Which do you think is worse, murder or suicide? And I think all of us understand that a Christian can commit murder. Then if you can be in such a state, you take the life of another. Why you don't think the person might take his or her own life? It's unfortunate that it's real. If you understand anxiety and understand depression, that a person can become so overwhelmed with a loss of value and worth that the only hope they see is to check out of here, is to leave, so that others can get on with their lives sometimes. Some type of sicknesses, condition that require others to make great sacrifice and put their life and their plan on pause. And so the patient, the client, thinks they are robbing other people of their liberty to go on, and so they enter in the valley of depression. And suicide becomes a viable option in their thinking. Can I understand the psychology of anxiety and depression? If you come to understand it, then you will know, yes, a believer can become that depressed and despondent. And that's why we have these commands to encourage one another, to carry one another when you're going through the valley and you're overwhelmed. We need to be aware of these things, for the enemy will use them. Anxiety, rage. What should have been a temporary passing act of righteous indignation, there comes a time in a believer's life you're going to hear stories of human atrocity, awful stories of a man raping a 9-year-old girl or boy. That's going to bring anger, angry, and rage within somebody who heard that. If you're a believer, then it's going to be righteous indignation. When David heard about the man, Nathan shared in the parable, the man who had 100 sheep and stole the one little lamb that the man had, David, righteous indignation took over David. Where is he, that man? Bring him here today. Don't schedule him for a court appointment tomorrow or down the road. Such atrocities need to be addressed now. Sense of urgency. So it's okay, you understand, as a believer, to be angry, to become outraged about something you have heard. But it must be temporary for the believer. You have until the sun goes down. The believer has 24 hours to deal with that which produces anger and righteous indignation before it takes a toll on your constitution. 24 hours you have. How does the Bible put it? Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Got to deal with it and take care of it, because it's going to affect, one, your health. Anger is a virus. It affects the carrier, not just the object of anger. And so you have to disarm it. If you don't, it becomes rage. And anything that becomes rage produces outrageous behavior. See? Yes. You guard your heart with all diligence, according to Proverbs, so that when you're exposed to these things, or when they hit home, like things happen to one of your nephews or nieces, because you have guarded your heart with diligence, you don't say, who did that? Let me go down there and take care of it. You don't try to be like the sons of thunder. There's a difference between the sons of thunder and the sons of God, the children of God. So you got to watch rage. And if you realize you're watching certain channels, certain types of even movies, or better yet, if you are always getting the latest news, breaking news, and you discover that you get outrageous, you get worked up because of these bad things in the news, you need to drop certain channels. Yes, you need to. Because you're going to lose control. And let me tell you why it is dangerous if you don't drop those channels. Not that you're going to drop and remove them to enter into pretension or into hypocrisy that everything is all right in the world. That's not the idea. But you're protecting your heart from having any form or level of anger becoming rage within us, especially for the male. For with the male, because of the production of testosterone, then it becomes hostility. The problem with rage and hostility in the human soul, if we don't deal with it, why we can manage it. If we ignore it, let me tell you what it does. It stays in your mind and your heart, in your soul. And when it reaches a certain level, it manifests itself against an unsuspecting victim. A victim that has nothing to do with the production of the rage. It's like a pressure cooker. The old traditional pressure cooker. If it's not properly managed and handled, then it builds up the pressure. It doesn't matter who comes in the kitchen when the pressure cooker can't take anymore. Well, it's the same thing, especially with the male. How I want my brothers to understand. God has wired us and our bodies produce more testosterone than the female because of the task God has given to us as male to protect, to provide, to secure. That's why Paul could say if a man doesn't provide for his family, he's worse than an infidel. The problem with us, we all think he's talking about food only. No. The man is supposed to provide all those things, including security. So some believers, I remember many years ago in Jamaica, when a very popular and a famous preacher was preaching, and he got excited and his jacket was lifted from his side, and a concealed weapon was exposed. And boy, I tell you, almost the whole country attacked and believed that that was an outrageous conduct. And I'm one of the persons who have said the only thing outrageous is your response to that. It's not like the man was carrying an illegal weapon. He was licensed to carry the weapon. Because we don't understand, God said if a man doesn't provide for his household, that means security. You as a male, and by the way, while we talk and condemn that preacher for carrying a weapon in the podium, most of us go to sleep in houses that have metal bars. So we accuse him of not having any faith. Well, when are you going to donate your metal bars to charity? It just shows you the duplicity that we have. I have faith, so I have burglar bars around my house. He doesn't have any faith, so he carries a weapon. When are we going to learn to respect the decisions of priests, head of the family? Some use burglar bars, some use a firearm. Both is an attempt to secure, to provide some form of security. The thing is that we get, usually because of sin, we get outraged about the wrong thing. That's another problem when we keep anger and don't deal with it and have them vent in a proper and an appropriate way, in an appropriate way. And so rage will create serious problem in your health. That's why sometimes the doctors will run their diagnostics physiologically. Nothing is wrong with your body biologically. And that's when the doctor refer you to see the psychologist. Thinks that the basis of your problem is not in your body, it's in your soul. It's in your psyche. And then they will do their diagnostic test. Now, if you are a believer, I just trust and hope that when the psychologists say that they too, like the physician, they don't see anything wrong, then you understand that there's a third aspect that needs to be scrutinized, and that is your spiritual life. A couple weeks ago, we have a dear sister who came on to the program and was giving testimony about her father. Some of you perhaps remember, and I did recognize and identify her father, who is with the Lord, happened to be one of my elders, one of the men who helped to shape my life and pour his into mine and his resources. And one of the things that he would never do, he would never, when he's sick, go to the doctor first. And he never got this information here. No knowledge of what we are talking about. He went to be the Lord before he could enjoy some of the spiritual fruits you're enjoying today from my ministry. But he practiced it. He wants the diagnostic test run first with his spiritual life. Then when there is no basis for that, then he goes to the doctor. No, we do the reverse. Sometimes we just abort the whole process after the second diagnostics because we ignore the impact of misbehavior in the spiritual life and how that affects our health and our future. So another time we talk about rage, we have to address rage. We have to address hostility and aggression. They are not synonyms. They are related. Hostility is never, ever positive. Aggression, properly guided by passion, can be a good thing. The male was made to be aggressive. That's why he possesses more testosterone than the female. So he can take initiatives. And I just want you to remember, like I said, hostility and aggressions are not synonyms. Hostility is the negative, purely negative. Anxiety, when properly managed and guided, becomes the masculine initiative. It motivates the male to take action, to go into action, almost like what we see with Uriah. Knowing what to do when. It's not so much the fight that the man is involved in, it's the fight that is in the man. Caleb and Joshua. 40 years ago, we were there when God told Moses to go and possess the land. And it's 40 years after, and Caleb and Joshua said, we are just as ready today as we were 40 years ago. That's not about the body. It's about the current fight in the man. We need men like that to rise to the occasion. Unless our churches produce some Joshuas and Calebs, then we are not going to produce the Samuels and the young men to bring back our society. We're not going to produce the Josiahs. Notice in your Bible, chronologically, the book of Joshua comes first. Comes before you have Josiah, come before you have a Samuel. But we need these type of men. You need to attend them as brothers. If you're here, there's a Bible study and alternate Saturdays, men's Bible study. Brother Howard will be happy to give you the information there. Alternate Saturdays. They had it Saturday last, so it's not going to be on this Saturday. And even if it were scheduled for this Saturday, it's Mother's Day weekend, so that would have been aborted anyway. Depression, I addressed that before. It's linked to anxiety. Bondage, wow. That also is related to addiction. There are 3 words you want to keep in your mind. And if we ever do any training in Christian counseling, I'll be happy to bring up these issues. It's addiction, bondage, and slavery. These are 3 vices that all believers face: addiction, bondage, and slavery. And they are not synonyms. They're quite different. And we need to understand them, because in this spiritual world, because addiction is not just about drugs. Addiction is not just about physical things that go inside your mouth. Addiction covers exposure of the 5 senses and the imagination. They usually leave that out. That is one of the reasons why some people are addicted to movies. It's not a physical addiction. It's an addiction that is linked to imagination. They want to see the latest special, and they call them effects that get you excited and jump out of your seat in the theater. Addiction is a serious thing. But they always target the five senses and your imagination. Genesis 6, God saw that the intent and the desire and the imagination of the heart was evil continually. We got to guard our imagination. There are certain movies I don't watch. I am just not into horror movies at all. I think life is horribly enough. Not only that I'm physically scared by it, but I refuse to be entertained by anything that has horror in it. You say, but it's just theatrics. See, that's exactly my problem. These things have taken the world innocently where it is, not realizing when your imagination is exposed to theatrics, they affect us. Sociologists are telling us. That's when they started to rate movies. Because only certain age group can watch certain conduct in the theatrics. If it never had an impact on young people, why don't they allow youth to watch all the movies? They know. But because of Hollywood's power and the money that is involved. And we as Christians need to understand that there are mental and psychological impact to what makes impression on your imagination. Why don't we follow what Paul says to the Philippians in chapter 4, 7 and 8? Whatever things are pure, whatever things that are of good report, noble, why don't we imagine these things? Think. Why don't we put our imagination focus on these things so that we can become pure as he's pure? We can become good as he is good. The secular world knows, and they use these things to control. Yes, they do. They use these things to control the minds of our people and the conduct and keep certain races and certain groups in slavery and keep us backward because they know if you access the imagination, you access their future. Do I sound passionate about this? Yes. As a counselor, I've been trying to get this across for many years. That when we go to church, we should seize the opportunity to impact the imagination. That's why we should use visual aids in our teaching. Not only audio, but visual. Impact the member before they leave and go back. Make the impact of good things. Testimonies of how God has been good and faithful. Stories of triumph of people who are facing challenges physically, mentally, but God. I was talking to Brother Jordan just yesterday about being in the presence of believers who have physical limitations. And when you just think that they somehow are unfortunate, when they tell you what they are doing for the Lord with their limitations, you have to ask yourself, are you serious? You have been doing that? And you think nothing is wrong with your body and you're not doing anything for the Lord. Well, nothing is wrong with your body. Something is just wrong with your soul. Their soul is focusing. Their imagination is being impressed by the right thing, but their body becomes a what? Their body becomes a contest, a struggle. We have an able body. but we were put our minds and imagination under bondage. That's what we are discussing. Under bondage. I told you about Alexandra Barkley, the blind evangelist, going to Bible school, and they assigned me, because of my work in evangelism, to work with that brother for 2 weeks in the hills of one of the parishes in Jamaica. 2 weeks. We developed a friendship. I learned so many things from that brother. When the 2 week was over, I went back to Bible school in tears. How I saw God use that brother and the knowledge. The guy was helping me with Greek. He had never seen a Greek letter all his life. He lost his eyesight when he was 3 months old. And when I saw what the grace of God could do with a man like that, I was a transformed student when I went back to Bible school. I was different. I just want you to know that. Totally different. I was never the same until this day. And then that's when you realize one thing again. When it comes to God and ministries, never by might nor by power. It's always by the Spirit of God. God can use you, yes, student, right where you are today. It doesn't matter about your age. You know, God has never called a person in the Bible and asked for a copy of your birth certificate. You know that. God has never done it. Because when God calls you to do a duty, he enables you, not your age, not your muscles, but his spirit. He can still use you. I love Caleb and Joshua. Yeah. Bondage, I was saying, addiction and slavery. Slavery is not just a physical thing. There's mental slavery. You have heard it in so many songs. We had it with the children of Israel. God delivered them from Egyptian bondage. That happened in a very short time, as you know. But after they left Egypt, 40 years to get Egypt out of their mind. It was so difficult and engraved, the Egyptian bondage. You remember at one stage in their journey to the promised land that some of them want to go back to Egyptian bondage. You remember? They said it's better for us to go back. Now, when you're walking with the Lord in your spiritual pilgrimage, and you come across a hurdle in the road, and you think being back there then is better, something is critically wrong. That's all I have to say. Something is critically wrong. Something is wrong. We can't just move on from here. We can't just take another step. When you think you're better off when you were not saved than since God has saved you. Yeah, something ain't right. So we have David praying in Psalm 51. Remember, Psalm 51 and Psalm 32 are related, right? Restore to me the joy of your salvation. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, I promise you, but I must tell you this. Be careful that your joy as a Christian is not linked to your salvation. Yeah, you heard me. Make sure the joy you have is not linked to your salvation. Make sure that the joy of the Christian life is based on God's salvation. David used the possessive case. The joy of your, not the joy of my salvation. Because so many people have different ideas how you can be saved and don't see that it's a gift. Not only that, people confuse joy and happiness. They are not synonyms either. Happiness is a state of elation and a state of positive pleasure that you're in because of what's happening around you. Happiness is a state of pleasure or elation that you're in based on what's happening around you. Joy is an internal state of pleasure and elation and contentment that you are experiencing in spite of what is happening around you. Happiness is dependent on external stimuli. Joy is linked to God in you, the hope of glory. It's linked to a transaction that God has done. It's internal. Another way to illustrate it, if you know this, the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer reflects and indicates the temperature. A thermostat changes temperature. One is passive, one is active. Happiness is passive. It's reflecting what's going on around you. Joy is a force that will take on anything that is external, giving you the assurance and contentment that it is settled. We have a hope that cannot be reversed. Our joy is linked to that. It's linked to where we are going, not what's happening around us or where we're coming from. Those are a very important distinction to make in your life. God has given joy to the Christian. Happiness is your choice. Joy is a gift and a condition. Happiness is your choice. In fact, there's a book with that title, written by Paul D. Meyer and Paul Minrith, two psychiatrists, Christian psychiatrists. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it heavily. Every Christian should read it. Happiness is a choice, it's called. Both guys work at the Dallas Theological Seminary for a year. I think they still today. They conduct the Meyer and Minrith Clinic in Dallas. I think they have 800 numbers and so forth. I was influenced very early in my training as a Christian counselor by the writings of these two guys in that classic book, Christian Psychiatry, written by that team. And we never look back. And they wrote Introduction to Christian Psychology and Counseling as a textbook we use, still use it today when I'm involved in training Christian counselors. But they present a very good biblical understanding on the distinction between happiness and joy. So David said then, restore that to me, that's gone. When you are not right with God spiritually, the things that require walk and pilgrimage with God have to disappear. And this is where people say, you're not saved. That's where when people say that or feel like they are not saved. God linked you to the light to walk in the light. Then if you're not walking in the light, you have all internal reason to believe that you're not in the light. Because when you walk in the light, you're not supposed to see darkness. So when we commit sin, it produces an eclipse. It does. And that's when we begin to see our shadows instead of the presence of God. Because we're not walking in the light. So important that we understand this. So the joy of the salvation is what disappeared, not the salvation. You can't be saved and be lost. Those are mutual exclusives. You can't be alive and dead at the same time. You can't be born and become unborn. Those are mutual exclusives. And those descriptions are used for salvation. What is missing is the joy, is the delight, is the elation that you possess that. And he said, you restore that by your generous spirit. uphold me. What does that mean? Give me stability. How, put it this way, what's the source of strength in the material world? Spirit. The material world gets its strength and sustenance from the spiritual. Man shall not live by bread alone. It's not the reverse. And that's why he said, uphold me, sustain me by your generous spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners shall be converted to you. One of the most powerful verses in Psalm 51 is verse 13. A number that many people don't like. They think there's a horror and there's a terror in it. A lot of people, I mean, it's a universal scare. It's a universal superstition. You know that. Hotels never usually have 13th floor. Anything to do even with government, they skip 13. Universal. I kid you not. Universal superstition. And I'm more like Howard when I was in Bible school. They're known as rebels. When in high school and Bible school. So when they came up with email, you ready for this? I decided to take on 13. So my email addresses chapter 13J. Chapter 13J. It's just another number. And notice the letter J. It wasn't so much for John as in John, as in me, but John chapter 13. You ever thought about that? Well, I don't want you to think about it. We can have the same email. But people are superstitious about that. I am not a superstitious person at all. At least I don't think I am. But some people, but look at this verse. Then I will teach transgressors your ways. You know, one of the reasons why we can't get over the power of sin in our lives as Christians, we don't tell others about our fall and our failure. We don't testify of the recovering power of God's grace. The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. We don't talk about that. That's one of the reasons why our secret sins keep us as victims, for we keep them secret. Look at this. Then I will teach transgressors your ways. I will teach them the recovery process. I will let them know that I have been there and done that. It's modern day Christians who want to cover up and hide the sins they already committed. Why do you think Paul was able to say, I am the chief of sinners? I have done it all, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. What qualifies us in the church to minister is not because we have not sinned. It's not because we have not lied. Those are angelic ministries. Why do you think the young people don't pay us much attention? We are fakes. We are chocolate soldiers. They are struggling with sexual temptation. We are angels. We are not sexual being at all. They will never tell us about struggles, most of us, struggles they are going through. Because when they hear our testimony, we were born from above, we came from above, and we live below, and we live above sin. Hypocrisy. People think we are born as angels. And in a hypocrisy, they think we are behaving as angels because we are covering up. I just want you to know, if you cover up, you can be a testimony of God's grace. Sin is dark. Grace is glowing with brilliance. You ever been to the jewelry store and noticed this? All jewelry store. The background on which they display all their precious stones and their diamonds and gold, always a dark shade. Dark velvet, dark purple, dark red. And then they display. Well, let me tell you something. God's grace is displayed in the background of our sinfulness. Yes. We need to admit to our young people that we have scars. We did that too, and because of that, there's hope for them. We need to let them know, yes, we fell along the way. Our success is not to fabricate a story that is inconsistent with truth. Our success comes in to empower them and to tell them where the devil trick us up and deceive us, but God. And so we expose the cosmetic goals that got us into trouble. Speak the truth qualifies us to show that, you know what, forgiveness works. I made that blunder, I made that mistake. Too many of our testimonies are glowing with hypocrisy and fakeness, that which is pseudo. And I don't want us to go to the extreme. I don't want us to take our failures and then model them in churches so that people want to commit that. I think that's a normal behavior. Is to share your failure with brokenness and contrition. And to show this, then I will teach transgressors your ways. The word for ways is direct. God's path. And sinners shall be converted. How does David know that if he were to tell of God's power and recovery, that sinners, because let me tell you something, sinners are not as comfortable in their bondage and slavery as much as you think they are. Somewhere along the line, they have aspects and piece of evidence that they were not designed to be born in the gutters of sin, to live there and depart there. That's where the Spirit of God convict them. That's what happened to the prodigal son. And when he said to himself, he came to his senses. That's what I'm talking about. My father has servants. I used to give commands and tell them to go, and they go. And look who, I am not even a servant of human being. I am serving swines. And the guy's thinking, he said, you know what, I'll arise. And he started to write his recitation that he's going to recite to his father. I will arise and I will say to my father, I have sinned against God and against you. And he wrote it, not knowing that he will not be given the chance to recite it, for his father was passionately, impatiently waiting for his return. Every day, that old man would go down and look up the street for his son. And his desire to have him home and the convicting ministry of the Holy Spirit reconcile both. And when he started to recite it, his father said, no, there's no need for that. What a reunion. God is waiting. He makes us uncomfortable while the Spirit of God convicts us that where we are, not what we ought to be. In my Father's house, there are many opportunities to serve, giving command. I want you to know today, as a student, as a Christian, as a child of God, God wants you to participate in his family business. He wants you to go downtown and preach the gospel and release people from bondage and let them know they carry his image. We are not orphans anymore. We have been ransomed, healed, and restored. We can release others. We can tell sinners that we don't have to serve sin for the rest of our lives. For there is a Redeemer, God's only Son, who gave his life for us. And we as Christians can live a better life. I can't guarantee you of happiness, but pleasure, joy, that we can guarantee from God's word, walking with the Lord. I can't guarantee you the best house or the best car, but contentment, yeah. You get a lot of that. You walk with the Lord. When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today's presentation. For some of us, it's an encounter. It's an experience. We thank you. We thank you for your Holy Spirit, who you sent to dwell in us permanently until you come for your bride. We thank you for him. And we're going to need him today as we walk out of this class to remind us, to reassure us, and to restore the joy of our salvation. Guide us, lead us, take our hands, precious Lord, and make us joyful and jubilant and rejoicing. For Jesus' sake we pray.
Out of my bondage, sorrow